book starts, innocently enough, with a line that would not be out of place in a Victorian coming-of-age novel or maybe a more recent publication intended for a young adult audience. One bright October day, 14 years ago, they came to the training school at Vineland, a little 8-year-old girl. That 8-year-old girl didn't just come to the training school at Vineland, she had been left there by an uncaring family, and while she was well looked after by the staff, a persistent stigma ensured she would never enjoy a full life. That little 8-year-old girl would grow into a young woman and attract the attention of the research staff at the training school, especially that of an inquisitive, promising psychologist, one who was dedicated to the betterment of society. Nothing wrong with that, except that said psychologist intended to improve humankind by segregating those who carried what he perceived as undesirable traits. That researcher would later conduct an investigation on the girl's family and publish his findings, his biased, methodologically unsound findings, into a wildly successful book which fanned the flames of one of the most hateful ideas of the 20th century. This is the story behind the Kallikak Family, a cursed Bible of the eugenics movement. The full title of our cursed book of the day is The Kallikak Family, a Study in the Hereditary of Feeble-Mindedness. It was published in 1912, and its author was American psychologist Henry Herbert Goddard, a staunch proponent of intelligence tests to measure feeble-mindedness among the general population, as well as foreign citizens migrating to the US via Ellis Island. And do please note that at the time, the phrase feeble-minded was one of many rather demeaning words and phrases used even in medical circles to label patients suffering from learning disabilities or from an overall lower intellectual functioning. We'll encounter many of these terms, which we'll have to quote verbatim from the works of Goddard and colleagues. But needless to say, we certainly don't endorse the use of such terms in a modern setting. It's just how things were at the time. Now, Goddard's work was presented as a case study on the history of the Kallikaks. This was an alias concocted by Goddard to narrate the alternate fortunes of a New Jersey family with a high incidence of feeble-mindedness, which often went hand in hand with traits such as criminal behavior or alcohol addiction. Now, we'll get into details of this supposedly scientific study, including the truth behind the real-life Kallikaks. The main thesis of this work was that intellectual and learning disabilities were hereditary. Thus, individuals with such traits should be removed from society or forcibly sterilized. In other words, both Goddard and his book played a key role in the rise of the eugenics movement in the United States and abroad. So much so that paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and historian of science Stephen Jay Gould called the Kallikak family, quote, the primal myth of the eugenics movement. Now look, for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, the term eugenics derives from the Greek words for good and growing. The word first was introduced in 1883 by the father of the movement, British polymath Francis Galton. Galton and his disciple, Carl Pearson, would popularize eugenics as the, quote, science of the improvement of the race. A science based on the idea that positive and negative character traits were essentially hereditary, and therefore the human species could be improved the same way that farmers improved the stock of their cattle. Galton was a proponent of positive eugenics, which included research programs to treat hereditary conditions, as well as incentive schemes to encourage the best and brightest to marry and reproduce. By the dawn of the 20th century, supporters of the eugenics movement tended to favor negative eugenics, the eradication of unfit elements of society via segregation, institutionalization, or even forced sterilization. And one of the most prominent devotees of negative eugenics was, of course, our friend Henry Goddard. Henry H. Goddard earned his doctorate degree in psychology in 1899. 2 years later, he met Edward Ransom Johnston, the principal of the New Jersey Training School for Feeble-Minded Children at Vineland. The two hit it off, and the former hired the latter as the director of research at the Vineland School, and in September of 1906, Goddard initiated his research on the causes of learning disabilities, but found that he lacked an objective benchmark to assess the intellectual capabilities of his young patients. The psychologist had a breakthrough in 1908. As he traveled across Europe, Goddard came across early intelligence tests for children devised by his British, Italian, and French colleagues. As he returned to America, the researcher divulged these evaluation tools with the intensively titled article, The Grading of Backward Children, the De Sanctis Tests, and the Binet and Simon Tests of Intellectual Capacity. Goddard was particularly fond of the Binet and Simon tests, which categorized children according to the concept of mental age. The original authors of the assessment categorized those with a mental age of 2 or younger as idiots. Those with a mental age of 3 to 7 were labeled imbeciles. Goddard added a third category encompassing children with a mental age of 8 to 12, morons. In the psychologist's views, the latter group was the most dangerous to society as their brains could not mature beyond their early teens. In 1909, Goddard energetically insisted that all staff at the Vineland School adopted his updated version of the Binet-Simon test. In the same year, the psychologist came to the conclusion that regardless of all efforts by the school's personnel, some children could not progress beyond their state of backwardness. Very simply, they could not learn to become competent, productive members of society. What was worse, Goddard's belief was that the children of said individuals were doomed to inherit their feeble-mindedness or other moronic traits. Now, Goddard's work and research at the Vineland School might have faded into obscurity had he not met the young woman which he referred to with the made-up name Deborah Kallikak. The infant known as Deborah was born in February 1889 in a homeless shelter. Her mother Melinda, a domestic servant, had conceived the baby out of wedlock with a man whose name remained unknown. Following Deborah's birth, Melinda married and later divorced another man before settling down with a farmer. Her second husband offered a stable life to Melinda, but demanded that she send Deborah away. At the time, Deborah's primary school teachers had reported that she did not get along with other pupils and was not doing well academically. That's all it took for her to be labelled as feeble-minded, which was very convenient, as it allowed Melinda and the farmer to dump the 8-year-old girl in the care of the Vineland Training School in New Jersey. Fantastic parenting, everybody. The school's record shows that upon admission, Deborah was illiterate but could look after herself and perform household chores. By 1901, at the age of 12, the girl had made some good progress. She could read and write, do maths, even play music by ear. Deborah's personality was described as excitable and affectionate, but she could be disruptive, impudent, and failed to pay attention in class. Deborah continued to live at Vineland, while Goddard took a keen interest in studying her capabilities and behavior. In April 1910, the psychologist subjected Deborah to his recently crafted intelligence test. According to the results, the young woman, now aged 21, had a mental age of 9, which made her a moron in Goddard's classification. That moron was nonetheless skilled at complex crafts such as woodworking and dressmaking, and while academically she appeared to be struggling, Deborah proved to be quite good at writing short stories. Goddard tested her again in October 1911, but the results didn't vary. The psychologist would report the results of these tests in the first chapter of the Kallikak Family. Quote, "This is a typical illustration of the mentality of a high-grade feeble-minded person, the moron, the delinquent, the kind of girl or woman that fill our reformatories. They are wayward, they get into all sorts of trouble and difficulties, sexually and otherwise." In the same chapter, Goddard would formulate a hypothesis to explain Deborah's alleged feeble-mindedness. In pure eugenic style, Goddard speculated that this was not caused by environmental factors or a psychiatric condition, or rather it was hereditary. Deborah and other morons, imbeciles, and idiots had inherited their traits from their equally feeble-minded parents and grandparents like a persistent curse from which there was no escaping. And in Deborah's case, who might have been the origin of the curse? In the second chapter of his book, the author proceeded to explain the methodology by which he would test his hypothesis. He trained a number of field workers, all women who had previously worked at Vineland, and had them reconstruct Deborah's family tree, interviewing her relatives and tracing her ancestors. Goddard and his field team eventually determined that many of Deborah Kallikak's relatives could be described as feeble-minded or even defectives and delinquents. But one field worker in particular, Miss Elizabeth S. Kite, came across a curious pattern. Some Kallikaks appeared to have done quite well for themselves. Far from being morons, they had succeeded in life and showed no delinquent traits. Quoting again from Goddard, "In the course of the work of tracing various members of the family, our field worker occasionally found herself in the midst of a good family of the same name, which apparently was in no way related to the girl whose ancestry we were investigating. These cases became so frequent that there gradually grew the conviction that ours must be a degenerate offshoot from an older family of better stock." Goddard and his collaborators came to the conclusion that there were two Kallikak lineages. In very simplistic terms, one side of the family was made of intelligent, respectable, successful, good people, and the other side featured generations of feeble-minded, disreputable, degenerate, bad people. This dualism inspired Goddard to choose a peculiar alias for the family. This was, of course, Kallikak, after the Greek words for good, kalos, and bad, kakos. Both lineages originate from the same man, a soldier in the American Revolutionary War, which Goddard called Martin Kallikak Sr. The soldier had a brief affair with an allegedly feeble-minded, unnamed tavern maid who later gave birth to Martin Kallikak Jr., whom Goddard and his field worker Elizabeth Kite nicknamed the Old Horror. The old horror married a woman identified as Rhoda's Beth, and the two went on to have 10 children, of which 8 survived infancy. Of these 8, 5 were described in the book as being feeble-minded, alcoholics, or sexually immoral. One child, nicknamed Old Moll, appeared to combine all 3 characteristics. According to Goddard, the spawn of the old horror had inherited the same negative traits as the unknown tavern maid. Their descendants, which amounted to 480 individuals, appeared doomed to fail in life while heaping misery upon society. In Goddard's words, quote, 143 of these, we have conclusive proof, were or are feeble-minded, while only 46 have been found normal. The rest are unknown or doubtful. This is the ghastly story of the descendants of Martin Kallikak Sr. from the nameless feeble-minded girl. Although Martin Sr. himself paid no further attention to the girl nor her child, society has had to pay the heavy price of all the evil he engendered. Now, about Martin Sr. After his dalliance with the unnamed tavern girl, the Revolutionary War veteran hooked up with a Quaker woman. Despite her father's opposition, the two tied the knot and went on to have 7 legitimate children. According to Goddard, this specific generation of Kallikaks and their offspring all, quote, married into the best families in their state, the descendants of colonial governors, signers of the Declaration of Independence, soldiers, and even the founders of a great university. The lineage was composed of respectable citizens, men and women prominent in every phase of social life. There have been no feeble-minded among them, no illegitimate children, no immoral women. There has been no epilepsy, no criminals, no keepers of houses of prostitution. In other words, the descendants of Martin Sr. and his Quaker wife put the good, the kalos, in Kallikak. In the 3rd chapter of his work, Goddard described the 2 strands of the family as the perfect experiment on the causes of feeble-mindedness. Both sides of the Kallikak clan shared a common ancestor, Martin Sr. Both sides lived in the same geographical area and in the same environments, and yet they experienced completely different outcomes. Clearly, the determining factor had been the genetic influence of the respective matriarchs, the bad tavern girl and the good Quaker lady. Martin Jr., aka Old Horror, passed on his defective inheritance to his children. They were not prevented from reproducing, thus passing on their defective genes to subsequent generations. Goddard drew a further conclusion. Feeble-mindedness or some form of alleged inherited intellectual disability was strongly correlated with antisocial, even criminal behavior. The author reported how between 26 and 66% of all children admitted to juvenile detention centers were, in fact, feeble-minded. In Chapter 4, Goddard admits that, quoting him again, facts and figures do not have flesh and blood reality in them. Thus, to really drive his point home, the author introduced specific case studies, graphic descriptions provided by Miss Kite of the squalid living conditions of some of the bad Kallikaks. This chapter has a vivid narrative style to it, which probably contributed to the later popularity of the book. In one section, Goddard describes the inhabitants of one household as lower than moron. There is no hope for this family to rise above poverty, as the woman at the head of this house was an imbecile. In one arm, she held a frightful-looking baby, while she had another by the hand. Vermin were visible all over her. The eldest daughter of said imbecile is described as a vulgar, repulsive creature of 15. She had somehow managed to live. All the rest of the children, except the 2 that the mother was carrying, had died in infancy. The author's conclusions are laid out in the 5th and final chapter, titled What is to be done? Now, we have some strong suggestions on what Goddard should have done, where he should have gone, and particularly where he should have stuffed his book. But this isn't a book review, so let's just summarize the man's points of view. His first conclusion was that feeble-mindedness was at the root of what he defined as degeneracy, a state of being which encompassed behaviors such as alcoholism, criminality, prostitution, and sexual promiscuity. Based on his investigation on the Kallikak family, Goddard reasoned that feeble-mindedness and degeneracy were not the result of social and environmental factors, but rather were hereditary. The author saw this as a huge problem for the American nation, as he estimated that, as of 1911, 300,000 inhabitants were feeble-minded. What if they all reproduced, spawning off an uncontrollable number of degenerates? Goddard's main proposed solution was to institutionalize and segregate feeble-minded individuals to prevent them from reproducing and thus to eradicate their unwanted traits from society. However, the psychologist admitted that such measures would be hugely expensive. Thus, he suggested an alternative method, removing from the male and female the necessary organs for procreation. The operation in the female is that of ovarectomy and in the male of castration. Goddard acknowledged that the general public might oppose such practices, which are akin to mutilation. They are mutilation, and so he introduced a third option: forced sterilization without the removal of the genitals. In the book's conclusion, the author reinforced the point that segregation of the feeble-minded was the preferred solution, with forced sterilization only to be considered as a temporary imperfect measure. As we covered earlier, the forced sterilization of people with intellectual disabilities, as well as other undesirable traits, was a key tenet of eugenics. By the 1910s and 1920s, this movement had its detractors, of course, but also many supporters amongst the medical community, the judiciary, law enforcement, and the general public. We should specify that Goddard and his book were not the sole engines behind the rise of eugenics in the United States. The movement would have probably become hugely popular even without the case study about Deborah and her ancestors. But Goddard's book surely struck a chord with Americans, and the Kallikak family became a success, so much so that a journalist called Joseph Medill Patterson even approached Goddard about developing a stage play about the Kallikaks, but that idea never materialized. Fortunately, Goddard was probably not too sad about the missed opportunity as he dried his tears with royalty statements. Readers could not get enough of the Kallikak family, and the book was reprinted a total of 12 times from 1912 to 1939. This is unsurprising, as the work counts fewer than 120 pages, contains a great deal of narrative elements, and is written in simple language. But the book garnered considerable success also among more scientific and institutional circles, even if the author himself admitted in the very introduction that his work carried little scientific rigor, quoting, "It is true that we have made rather dogmatic statements and have drawn conclusions that do not seem scientifically warranted from the data. We have done this because it seems necessary to make these statements and conclusions for the benefit of the lay reader." For decades, fans of eugenics principles cited the Kallikak family as a solid reference, irrefutable proof that certain traits were inherited and not the result of environmental factors. The book was even instrumental in a landmark US Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell, of May 1927. The case revolved around Carrie Buck, a feeble-minded woman who had been institutionalized by the state of Virginia. Ms. Buck was to be subjected to forced sterilization, a procedure allowed by state law. The patient and her lawyers, however, argued that the procedure would have been unconstitutional. The director of Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, Joseph Spence DeJarnette, used the Kallikak family as a reference to uphold the state law on sterilization, which in turn influenced the final ruling of Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Holmes ruled that the law on sterilization was indeed constitutional. Not only that, it was a highly valuable and useful law to protect the nation from incompetence and generations of imbeciles. The US was not the only country to devour Goddard's 120 pages. In 1914, pedagogue Carl Wilker translated the Kallikak family into German. The book was reprinted in 1933, the same year in which the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany. Upon seizing control, the party passed its infamous Law for Preventing of Offspring with Hereditary Defects. The law, which had been based on the legislation drafted by Harry H. Laughlin, an American eugenicist and star witness at the Buck and Bell trial. Based on the Prevention of Offspring Act, the Third Reich forcibly sterilized some 375,000 citizens from 1934 to 1939. This already hateful program morphed into the even worse euthanasia program, known as T4, which resulted in the murder of 80,000 patients deemed feeble-minded, disabled, and unworthy to live. As per the US, the American Eugenics Society would have loved to sterilize up to 10% of the total population, but they had to content themselves with a mere 60,000 forced sterilizations conducted by state and federal authorities, all before eugenics programs were shut down in 1936. By then, the scientific community in most democracies had realized that eugenics was tantamount to bovine manure of the worst grade. And yet some governments continue to hold on to the idea that certain individuals should be prevented from reproducing. One notable case is that of Sweden. From 1922, the Swedish government conducted mass sterilizations on mentally ill individuals and on women in vulnerable social circumstances. In total, some 60,000 individuals had their right to reproduce forcibly withdrawn. What is worse is that the program was terminated in, wait for it, 1976. One of the first academics to realize that the Kallikak family held little scientific method was, well, Henry Goddard himself. By the early 1920s, the author admitted that the conclusions of his study were inaccurate and indefensible. By 1926, psychiatrist Abraham Marson criticized Goddard's work in his own book titled The Inheritance of Mental Disorder. Martin attacked Goddard's methodology, questioning the training of his field workers and the interpretation of his intelligence tests. And in 1940, psychologist Knight Dunlap issued another one-star review, stating that the Kallikak family had no credibility in psychology. 2 years later, Henry Goddard appeared to have a change of heart. Once his own critic, the psychologist defended his work in an article published by the journal Science, claiming that his conclusions were accurate and reliable. By then, most democracies had rejected the tenets of eugenics, but the Kallikak family appeared to have left a permanent mark on popular culture and on the general public's views on how to deal with intellectual disability. Scouring through the newspaper archives of the Library of Congress, it appears evident how journalists, well into the 1950s, took the study's findings for granted. An article in Washington, D.C.'s Evening Star, dated January 10, 1949, described how congressmen actively coveted the vote of the less fortunate. Quote, "They know the power of the have-nots at the ballot box, the vote of an indolent, perpetual reliever, father of numerous brats of Kallikak grade, helps as much in electing an official as the vote of a millionaire." While a first-page piece on the August 5, 1954 issue of the Miami Labor Citizen reads, "As the Kallikak breed, there seems to be considerable evidence that Hereditary was to blame for the human production of numbskulls on the side of one parent. This went on for a number of generations, and all the offspring were reputed to be imbeciles of the first rank." End quote. This unfortunate family even became a set of recurring characters in the newspaper comic strips Wash Tubbs and Captain Easy. At least 2 generations of a family called Kallikak appear as comedic foils to the heroic protagonists and are invariably presented as dishonest and dim-witted. One of them, Buster Kallikak, appears to be portrayed as a caricature of someone with a learning disability and starts every sentence with a quite telling, "Duh." Classy, guys. Classy. The final blow to the credibility of Goddard's work was dealt by Professor J. David Smith, Specialized Education Services, University of North Carolina at Greensboro. In 1985, Professor Smith published his book, Minds Made Feeble: The Myth and the Legacy of the Kallikaks. This was followed by a 2012 article titled, Who Was Deborah Kallikak? In preparation for these works, Smith and co-author Michael L. Wermeyer were able to reconstruct the real identities and real-life stories of the main characters in Goddard's book. Let's take Martin Kallikak Jr., for example, the old horror who had allegedly spawned hordes of degenerates. Smith and Wermeyer found that his real name was John Wolverton, born in 1776 in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. John married in 1804 and became a widower in 1826. Unlike the Martin Jr. of Goddard's book, John Wolverton appeared to be a fairly successful and level-headed landowner who had taken great care of providing for his children and grandchildren. An 1850 census record shows how John was living with one of his daughters and several of his grandchildren at the time. The record also noted that all adults in the household were literate, which was not a given at the time. The 2 authors were also able to retrace the steps of a woman whom Goddard described as Old Sal, the feeble-minded 4th child of Martin Jr. According to Goddard, Old Sal had married an equally disadvantaged man, siring 2 defective children. These children married equally degenerate spouses, producing yet more generations of sterilization-worthy individuals. In real life, Old Sal was actually Catherine Ann Wolverton. Her sons, who had served during the Civil War, and their own children and grandchildren included a successful businessman in Iowa, at least 3 school teachers, and an Army Air Corps pilot during World War II. Doesn't sound like they were doing so bad. Smith and Wermeyer also disproved the myth that the character of Martin Kallikak Sr. had initiated 2 parallel lineages of bad and good descendants. There were, in fact, 2 separate branches of Wolvertons living in and around New Jersey when Goddard's field workers performed their investigation, but their forefathers were not a Martin Sr. and a Martin Jr. The family trees could be traced back to 2 second cousins, both named John Wolverton, neither of whom was an illegitimate child, let alone the father of an illegitimate child. The authors found evidence that some of the Wolvertons did live in unfortunate conditions by the early 20th century, but there was not a clear distinction setting a successful branch apart from a struggling one. That was nothing more than a narrative defect concocted by Goddard and possibly Elizabeth Kite to fit their point of view, or rather to fit the myth they were creating. Quoting from Smith, the Wolverton story was distorted so as to be interpreted according to a powerful myth and then used to further bolster that myth. The myth was that of eugenics. More importantly, If some of the Wolvertons had experienced poverty, low levels of education, neglect, and an unhappy family life, this was not the result of hereditary traits. This was the consequence of large-scale societal and environmental changes, chiefly the rapid urbanization of the American East Coast. As described by Smith and Waymeyer, quote, "The Wolvertons were swept with millions of rural Americans and immigrants into the bowels of America's urban areas, into lives that were often barely livable." But what about the young lady who started it all, the real-life Deborah Kallikak? Well, she was actually called Emma Wolverton. Following the publication of Goddard's book, Emma became something of a celebrity at the Vineyard Training School for Feeble-Minded Children. This did not help improve her situation as an institutionalized moron. In fact, in 1914, the young woman was transferred to the New Jersey State Institution for Feeble-Minded Women, where she continued to live and work for decades. Initially, she was employed as a nanny and a nurse's aide, while learning to play the cornet for the institution's band. In 1925, at the age of 36, Emma was put to work at the resident theatre in charge of costumes, sets, and props. In 1957, Wolverton met psychologist Elizabeth Cooper Allen, then a recently hired intern at the institution. Allen spent much time with Emma, noting that while her tests indicated a mental age of 9, she was an intelligent, informative, interesting, and overall competent woman. Allen, the already quoted Smith and Waymeyer, as well as psychologist James Walter Dennett at Arizona State University, all agree that Goddard's most famous patient, quote, "very likely did not have any sort of mental or developmental disability. She may have struggled during her early schooling, and Deborah Vineland noted how she could be argumentative and sometimes she would display a bad temper. But would those elements alone warrant a lifelong institutionalization? Well, Henry H. Goddard lost contact with Emma after she'd left the Vineland School in 1914, but he resurfaced again in 1946 when he sent a Christmas card to his former patient. Years later, Emma recounted the event to psychologist Elizabeth Allen. According to Dr. Dennett, Wolverton told Allen that the best thing about the card was that it showed Goddard thought she still had the intelligence to understand and read it. Goddard would not follow up on his card nor try to know better the woman behind what was essentially the fictional Deborah Kallikak. The psychologist passed away in 1957. Emma died in 1978 at the age of 89. The year before her death, Emma was diagnosed with arthritis and endured severe pain. She was offered to leave the New Jersey State Institution for Feeble-Minded Women. Emma declined the offer, as the institution was the only home she'd ever known, although she openly despised the label feeble-minded. In fact, there was absolutely no evidence that Emma suffered from a learning disability, and yet she had lived 81 of her 89 years according to Henry Goddard's preferred method of dealing with defective individuals, cut off from society, prevented from pursuing her aspirations, from raising a family, from experiencing life as she deserved. Thank you for watching.